Imagine you're standing on a sidewalk in Manhattan, 1925. It's 11 p.m. The streets are wet from an earlier rain, the gas lamps casting orange shadows over the cobblestones. You're wearing your best suit. You've heard about this place from a friend of a friend, someone who whispered the address like it was a secret worth dying for. You find the door. It looks like a laundry shop, a barber, a flower store, nothing special, nothing that says, "Come in." But you knock, 3 times slow, 2 times fast, and a small slot opens at eye level. 2 dark eyes stare at you. You say the word, just one word, and the door swings open. What you hear next will change you forever. Jazz, raw, electric, alive, hitting you in the chest like a physical force. Cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. Women in beaded dresses laughing too loud for 1925. Men in pinstripe suits leaning over tables with glasses of whiskey, real whiskey, illegal whiskey, grinning like they just got away with something, because they had. Welcome to a New York speakeasy. And this hidden, dangerous, electric world is what we're reconstructing today. This is not a story about criminals. This is a story about an entire civilization that built itself underground when the law told them they couldn't live the way they wanted. Between 1920 and 1933, the United States government passed the Volstead Act, enforcing the 18th Amendment, prohibition. The production, sale, and transportation of alcohol was illegal. Completely, federally, done. What happened next is one of the most fascinating social explosions in American history. By 1925, New York City alone had an estimated 30,000 speakeasies. 30,000. That's more than double the number of legal bars that existed before Prohibition. The government banned alcohol and accidentally created the greatest party the country had ever seen. But here's what nobody tells you. Life inside a speakeasy wasn't just about drinking. It was about identity. It was about freedom. It was about race, class, jazz, danger, corruption, glamour, and survival, all crammed into a basement with a piano player who hadn't slept in 2 days. Stay with us, because what happened inside those walls will shock you, move you, and make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the 1920s. If you've ever wondered what it actually felt like to be alive in 1925 New York, not in a museum, not in a textbook, but really alive, in the dark, with a drink in your hand and the law one knock away, this documentary is for you. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one. Now let's go deeper. Because before you could even get to a speakeasy, you had to know someone. This was not a world you stumbled into. It was a world you were invited into. The social network of the speakeasy was built on trust, and trust was currency. Historians like Michael Lerner, author of Dry Manhattan, documented how word of mouth was the only advertising that existed. You didn't put an ad in the newspaper. You didn't hang a sign. You told one person, who told one person, and the chain of whispers did the rest. And those whispers crossed every social boundary that daytime New York enforced. Here's the extraordinary thing, and this is backed by historical record. The speakeasy was one of the first genuinely integrated social spaces in American history. Black jazz musicians played for white audiences. White flappers danced to black music. Wealthy socialites sat next to dock workers. Immigration had flooded New York with Irish, Italian, Jewish, and Eastern European communities. And in the speakeasy, all of that compressed into one room, sharing the same illegal drink, laughing at the same joke. Dr. Burton Peretti, in his landmark study, Jazz in American Culture, wrote that the speakeasy created a social promiscuity that polite society had never permitted. That's the academic version. The real version is people who weren't supposed to be in the same room finally were, and something beautiful, and sometimes dangerous, came out of it. The average speakeasy in 1925 Manhattan was located in a basement, a back room, or behind a false wall. The famous 21 Club on West 52nd Street had a secret wine cellar accessible only through a hidden door operated by a long iron poker. When police raided, and they raided often, the bartender hit a switch, and every bottle on the shelves slid down a chute into the sewer below. Not a single bottle was ever confiscated. That's not fiction. That's documented history, and it tells you everything about how serious these people were. The people who made it happen. Let's talk about who actually ran this world. Because behind every speakeasy, behind the jazz and the laughter and the beaded dresses, there was a machine. A human machine running on ambition, corruption, and extraordinary risk. The owners of speakeasies in 1925 New York were a wildly diverse group. Some were former saloon owners who had simply moved their operation underground when Prohibition hit. Some were immigrants, particularly Irish and Italian, who saw an economic opportunity where everyone else saw a closed door. And some were connected to organized crime in ways that were impossible to ignore. Let's be honest about something. The mob didn't create the speakeasy. The speakeasy created the mob as we know it. Before Prohibition, organized crime in America was scattered, local, and relatively small scale. The moment alcohol became illegal, it became a product worth killing for Frau, and the criminal networks that formed to distribute it became the most powerful organizations in American history. Arnold Rothstein, Lucky Luciano, Al Capone. These names became legends because Prohibition handed them a monopoly on something 130 million Americans still desperately wanted. The FBI's own historical records confirm that by 1925, bootlegging was generating over $3 billion annually in the United States. In 1925 dollars. That is an almost incomprehensible amount of money. But let's bring this back down to the human level, because that's where the real story lives. The bartender at a 1925 speakeasy was one of the most skilled and respected people in the room. This wasn't a job you could just apply for. You needed to know how to identify bad liquor, and bad liquor in 1925 could kill you. Methanol poisoning from poorly made bootleg spirits killed an estimated 10,000 Americans during Prohibition. The government itself, and this fact is deeply disturbing, actually ordered industrial alcohol to be poisoned with methanol to discourage drinking, knowing that some of it would end up being consumed. Historian Deborah Bloom documented this in The Poisoner's Handbook, calling it one of the most chilling public health decisions ever made by an American government. The bartender at a good speakeasy was the man standing between you and that bottle. He knew where the whiskey came from. He knew which suppliers could be trusted. He often knew the local police by name because he was paying them. And this brings us to the police. Here's a question that might keep you up tonight. How did 30,000 illegal bars operate in plain sight in a single city? The answer is corruption so systematic, so normalized, and so deeply embedded in the city's DNA that it functioned like an open secret. The New York Police Department during Prohibition was not fighting the speakeasies. In many cases, it was protecting them for a price. Precinct captains negotiated monthly payments from speakeasy owners. The money traveled upward through the system. Inspectors, commissioners, politicians, the chain of corruption reached extraordinary heights. The Seabury investigation of 1930 to 1931, which you can read in full in the New York State Archives, revealed that police officers were collecting hundreds of dollars a week in graft from speakeasy owners across Manhattan. One captain was found to have $385,000 in personal savings on a salary of $6,000 a year. Let that sink in. And now ask yourself, who was really running New York in 1925? Because it wasn't the mayor, and it wasn't the police commissioner. It was a network of men and women who had decided that the law was wrong and had built an entire parallel civilization to prove it. The women deserve particular attention here. Female speakeasy owners were far more common than history has acknowledged. Texas Guinan, nicknamed Queen of the Night, ran some of the most famous clubs in Manhattan and famously greeted every customer with the words, "Hello, sucker." She was arrested multiple times, never convicted once, and became one of the most photographed women in New York. Her clubs on West 54th Street were documented in the New York Times and Variety magazine as genuine cultural institutions. If you're enjoying this reconstruction of 1925 New York, subscribe right now. Hit that button and ring the bell. There's so much more history where this came from. A night inside, what you saw, heard, and tasted. Let's do something different. Let's walk you through a single night inside a mid-level speakeasy in Greenwich Village, New York, 1925. Not the famous 21 Club, that was for celebrities and senators. This is the kind of place your grandfather might have gone to. Real, ordinary, extraordinary. You arrive at 9 p.m. The entrance is through a coal chute in an alley off Bleecker Street. This was a documented setup used by several village establishments. You descend 6 steps and push through a heavy curtain. The air hits you immediately, warm, thick with tobacco smoke, grease from the kitchen, and something sweet that turns out to be cheap perfume and cheaper gin. The room holds about 60 people at capacity. Tonight it's at 80, round wooden tables with no tablecloths, mismatched chairs, candles stuck in wine bottles. The lighting is deliberately low, not for romance, but because low lighting made police identification of specific customers nearly impossible during a raid. In the corner, a 5-piece jazz band is playing. Piano, bass, trumpet, clarinet, drums. The trumpet player is black. 3 of the other musicians are white. Nobody in this room, in this moment, seems to consider this unusual. In 1925 America, the same year the Ku Klux Klan had 4 million members, this integration was not incidental. It was radical. The menu is simple because it had to be. A typical village speakeasy in 1925 served food, not because the owner was a restaurateur, but because selling food gave them legal cover. Beer, whiskey, gin, and near beer. The legal 0.5% alcohol brew that everyone topped with a splash of real alcohol from under the bar were the real products. Historical menus recovered from period police raid reports show prices. Whiskey cost 25 cents a glass. A bottle of champagne, if they had it, could run $5, which was 2 days' wages for a factory worker. Think about that for a moment. People were spending 2 days' wages on a single bottle of bubbly. That tells you everything about how much this world meant to them. The music never stopped. This is documented in first-hand accounts collected by oral historians in the 1960s and 1970s from people who actually lived through Prohibition. Musician Eddie Condon, who played at dozens of village speakeasies in the 1920s, wrote in his memoir, "We called it music," that the music was the reason anyone came, even when they told themselves it was the whiskey. The jazz in a speakeasy was not background music. It was a conversation happening in real time between musicians who were improvising, competing, showing off, and sometimes playing for their lives because a good enough set meant the owner paid you. A bad one meant you walked home in the cold. The dances that happened in speakeasies were also technically illegal in many contexts. The Charleston, which had become a national craze by 1925, was banned in several dance halls because city officials considered it indecent. In a speakeasy, no one cared. Women danced with men they had just met. Women danced with other women. Nobody photographed it. Cameras were too conspicuous and too dangerous, which means the only record we have of what speakeasy dancing actually looked like comes from written memoirs, police reports, and the occasional newspaper sketch. And here's the hook that might blow your mind. The raid was often choreographed. Documented accounts from the memoirs of former NYPD officers reveal that raids on speakeasies were frequently pre-announced. The owner would get a tip, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. The valuable bottles disappeared. The staff vanished. A few decoy patrons were left behind to be arrested, often for a small payment. The police recorded a successful raid. The speakeasy reopened the next night. It was theater, criminal theater, performed for the newspapers and the anti-prohibition lobbying groups and the federal agents who kept demanding results. The people of New York had collectively decided that this particular law was not going to be enforced, and they were right. Tell us in the comments, what surprises you most about life in 1925? We want to know what you're thinking right now. The music, the danger, and the end of a world. By 1925, jazz was not just music. It was a political statement wrapped inside a trumpet solo. To understand why this matters, to understand why a speakeasy in 1925 was genuinely dangerous in a way that went beyond the illegal alcohol, you have to understand what jazz meant in that specific moment in American history. Jazz had come to New York from New Orleans and Chicago, carried by black musicians who had migrated north during what historians call the Great Migration. Between 1910 and 1930, approximately 1.6 million black Americans left the South for northern cities, escaping racial terror and seeking economic opportunity. They brought their music with them. The white establishment hated jazz. Not metaphorically, literally. The New York Times published editorials in the early 1920s calling jazz a barbaric assault on civilized music. The Ladies' Home Journal described it as a menace. Anne Shaw Faulkner, writing in the Musical Quarterly in 1921, claimed, and this was considered a serious academic argument at the time, that jazz caused physical and moral degeneration. And yet, by 1925, it was the most popular music in America. The Speakeasy was the institution that made this possible, because in a legitimate concert hall or hotel ballroom, black musicians were often excluded, or, if included, forced to enter through service entrances and forbidden from socializing with white audiences. But in a basement speakeasy, where everyone was already breaking the law just by being there, those barriers became somewhat negotiable. The Harlem speakeasies, particularly those in what became known as the Jungle Circuit around 133rd Street, were the most famous in the city. The Cotton Club, which operated from 1923 onwards, is the most well-known, though it had a complicated history. Black musicians performed there, but the audiences were exclusively white. Other, less famous Harlem speakeasies had no such rule. The Nest Club, the Lenox Club, and dozens of others documented in James Haskins' The Cotton Club hosted genuinely integrated crowds. Duke Ellington got his first major break in New York playing at the Hollywood Inn Speakeasy on Broadway in 1923. Fats Waller played regular sets at speakeasies across Harlem throughout the mid-1920s. Louis Armstrong passed through New York in 1924 and was immediately absorbed into the speakeasy circuit. These weren't just performances. These were the moments that created American music as we know it. Now let's talk about the danger, because it was real and it was constant and it touched everyone. The violence associated with bootlegging in New York in 1925 was not random. It was organized, targeted, and deeply connected to the competition between gangs controlling liquor distribution. The beer wars that raged between Irish gangs in the Bronx, Italian gangs in Manhattan, and Jewish gangs in Brooklyn cost hundreds of lives between 1920 and 1930. The federal government's own Wickersham Commission, reporting in 1931, documented over 500 gang-related murders in New York during the Prohibition era. When a speakeasy owner changed suppliers or tried to, the consequences could be fatal. Several documented cases from NYPD homicide records from 1924 to 1926 show speakeasy operators shot in their own establishments. This was not abstracted crime novel violence. This was happening on real streets, in real basements, to real people who had families and names and stories. And the ordinary customer, the secretary, the dock worker, the nurse who came in on Friday night to dance, lived with this knowledge somewhere in the back of their mind, even as the jazz played and the whiskey went down warm. There's something profoundly human about that. The awareness that the place you love might be dangerous, and going anyway. Because what the speakeasy offered wasn't just alcohol. It was a version of freedom that 1925 America could not offer anywhere else. The 18th Amendment was repealed on December 5, 1933. Prohibition ended. The speakeasies closed, or rather, many of them simply got licenses and became legal bars overnight. The secret doors were bricked up, the false walls came down, the coal chute entrances were sealed, but something was lost too. The jazz musician Mez Mesro, who played speakeasies throughout the 1920s, wrote in his memoir Really the Blues that, when the bars went legal, something went out of the music. The danger was part of the sound. He was right. The speakeasy at its peak, 1924, 1925, 1926, was something the world had never seen before and has never quite replicated since. A place where the law was absent, where race and class were temporarily suspended, where music was improvised in real time for people who knew in the back of their minds that the night might end with a knock on the door. That tension, that beauty, that danger, that is what this was. If this documentary moved you, if you learned something, felt something, saw history differently, subscribe right now. Leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, what surprised you most, what you want us to reconstruct next. Every comment, every subscriber is what makes this channel possible. We'll see you in the next one.